The first night inside the predator dens was meant to break them. The predators had done this many times before with other species, and the outcome was always the same. Fear filled the air, despair settled quickly, and the weak gave in. That was the lesson the predators wanted to teach. That strength belonged only to those who could endure cruelty. When the humans were brought in, they were treated no differently. The dens were dark, the ground was cold, and the walls echoed with the growls of unseen beasts. It was a place designed to crush the spirit of anyone forced inside. The humans were young, barely more than cubs themselves. Their faces showed confusion at first, then fear as the heavy gates closed behind them. They were pushed together, huddling in silence as the predators watched from the shadows. No one spoke. The silence was heavy, and for a moment it seemed as if this time, too, the experiment would end in the same way. But something happened that the predators had not expected. Instead of scattering in fear, the human cubs moved closer to one another. They did not push each other aside or fight for space. A small hand reached out and held another. Soon, several hands linked together, and what had begun as fear slowly turned into comfort. They were still afraid, yes, but they were not alone in that fear. The predators watching were unimpressed at first. They had seen other species cling to each other in the beginning, but unity never lasted. Hunger, cold, and the long nights usually tore companions apart. The strongest survived, the weakest fell, and that was the way of things. Or so the predators believed. The first test was hunger. For 2 days, no food was given. The humans grew weaker, their stomachs empty, their lips dry. The predators waited for them to fight over scraps of moss or stones, as other species had done before. Yet the humans surprised them again. When one of the youngest began to cry in hunger, the older ones gave up what little they had saved for themselves. They searched the corners of the den for insects and split them into tiny shares. No one was left behind. No one was left hungry while others ate. By the third night, the predators grew restless. Why were the humans not turning against each other? Why were they not breaking the way they were supposed to? The dens had been carefully designed for hopelessness, but these cubs found hope in the simplest acts. A smile, a whispered word, a hand brushing away tears. It was something the predators had never understood. Kindness as a weapon, compassion as a shield. The predators introduced cold next. They opened vents in the stone walls, letting icy winds flow through the den. The humans shivered, teeth clattering, but they adapted quickly. Instead of suffering alone, they gathered into a circle. They wrapped their arms around each other, sharing body heat. The smallest ones were placed in the center, shielded by the older children who endured the cold so that the younger might sleep. That night, the predators saw something that unsettled them. The humans, even in their exhaustion, began to hum softly. A simple tune, low and steady, passed from one child to another. It was not loud, but it carried through the den like a gentle fire. The humming calmed their fear, warmed their hearts, and gave them courage to face the night. None of them cried out. None of them begged for release. The predators whispered among themselves. This was not how things were supposed to unfold. By now, the cubs should have been broken, fighting, clawing, screaming. Instead, they were growing, stronger together. It was as if the harshness of the den was not breaking them, but forging something new. The following week was even harsher. The predators released sounds of roars and claws scraping against the stone. They wanted to frighten the cubs into panic. Some of the younger ones trembled, covering their ears, but the older humans drew them close and whispered reassurance. "It's only noise," one said quietly. "We are safe here together." That phrase repeated again and again, and slowly the panic eased. The predators tried more tricks. They spilled water into the den, flooding the ground so that the cubs had no dry place to sleep. The humans, instead of collapsing in misery, worked together. They stacked stones, created small platforms, and shared spaces so that no one was left standing in the freezing water. Where one brain alone might have failed, many minds working together found solutions. It was then that the predators began to see the first signs of defiance, not in aggression, but in survival. The cubs were not playing the role of victims. They were adapting, building, learning, and more importantly, they were caring for one another in ways the predators had never considered valuable. The predators valued strength of claw and tooth, the ability to dominate and overpower. They valued fear as a tool of control. But these humans seemed to possess another kind of strength. It was not loud or violent. It was quiet, patient, and deeply connected to each other. They did not seek to dominate their companions, but to lift them. One evening, when the shadows grew long, a predator elder entered the den to see for himself. He expected to find broken cubs huddled in despair. Instead, he found a strange scene. The humans were sitting in a circle, sharing what little food they had managed to gather, their eyes tired but calm. The elder noticed how one of the smallest had fallen asleep against the shoulder of another, and how carefully that child was being held so as not to wake them. It was not weakness he saw. It was something far more dangerous: unity. The elder left in silence, troubled by what he had witnessed. More days passed. The predators began to push harder, extending the trials. But the humans had learned something important in those early days, that they could endure anything if they endured it together. Hunger, cold, fear, and noise could not break them, because they shared the burden. What one could not carry, another did. And slowly, the predators realized they were facing something they had never encountered before. These humans were not like the others. They would not break. What the predators did not understand, but the humans already knew deep within themselves, was that real strength did not come from the body alone. Real strength came from spirit, from love, from the refusal to let go of one another. The harsh beginning, meant to be their end, became instead their first lesson in survival. It was the start of something greater, a story that would one day echo far beyond the cold stone dens. The predators had thrown humans into darkness, expecting to see weakness. What they found instead was a light that could not be put out. And, though it was only the beginning, the predators had already made their first mistake. They had underestimated what it meant to be human. The predators had thought that hunger and cold would be enough to break the human cubs. But after many nights, they were still standing, still holding each other, still finding ways to survive together. The predators grew restless. If these small ones would not break easily, then harsher trials would have to follow. The next stage was meant to crush hope. Strange noises echoed from the stone walls, scratching claws, heavy roars, and sudden crashes in the dark. The sounds were made to remind the cubs that they were surrounded by danger, that one wrong move would mean death. It was a trick that had worked countless times before. But the humans reacted differently. The youngest children shivered, covering their ears, tears shining in their eyes. Yet before the fear could take over, the older ones reached out. They pulled the smaller children into their arms, whispered steady words, and began to hum the same soft tune they had used in the freezing nights. The melody grew until it filled the den. The roaring outside could not silence it. The predators expected screams of fear, but instead heard voices, shaky yet brave, rising against the noise. It was a spark, a small, fragile spark, but one that lit a fire inside them. The predators did not understand why. They had always believed fear was stronger than courage, but humans were showing something new. They were not fearless. Their bodies shook, their eyes were wide, their hearts pounded fast. But even while afraid, they chose to fight back in their own way, not with claws, not with weapons, but with the will to comfort each other, to hold the line together. The predators changed tactics. One day, the heavy gates opened and the humans were pushed into a new chamber. This one was larger, darker, and filled with strange objects. Piles of stones, dripping water, and broken pieces of metal scattered across the floor. The predators were testing them again. The children quickly realized the ground was dangerous. Sharp edges cut into their feet. Loose stones shifted beneath them. Some stumbled, some fell. The predators watched closely, waiting to see who would be left behind. But no one was left behind. When one child tripped, another reached down and pulled them back up. When the sharp stones cut into their skin, they tore strips of cloth from their own clothes and wrapped the wounds. They were tired, bleeding, and weak, but they moved, together as one. And then something surprising happened. One of the older cubs looked at the scattered metal and stones not as obstacles, but as tools. They began stacking the stones, placing the metal pieces on top. The others followed, curious. Soon they had built a small platform where the youngest could sit away from the sharp ground. It wasn't much, but it showed something dangerous to the predators. Humans were not just surviving, they were adapting. They were creating solutions where none existed. That night, the predators argued among themselves. What they had witnessed was not instinct alone, it was choice. The humans were choosing to fight back against despair in small, clever ways. Each choice might have looked insignificant to the predators, but together these sparks formed a fire that was growing brighter. The humans, of course, did not think of it as defiance. To them, it was natural. If one child was hungry, the others shared. If one was cold, the group huddled tighter. If one was hurt, the others cared for them. To the predators, this was rebellion against the natural order. But to the humans, it was simply who they were. Days turned into weeks. The trials became harder. At times, the predators released bursts of smoke into the den, choking the air and making it hard to breathe. The children coughed, their eyes watering, their lungs burning. The predators thought panic would finally break them. Instead, the humans crawled together to the lowest points of the chamber, helping each other press cloth against their mouths to filter the smoke. They coughed and gasped, but they endured. When the smoke cleared, they were weaker, but still alive. The sparks of defiance grew brighter. Once the predators dropped scraps of raw meat into the den, far less than what was needed for all. Other species, when faced with this test, had turned savage. They had fought over every bite, clawing at each other, proving the predator's belief that survival belonged to the strongest alone. But the humans, they split the scraps evenly, even if the pieces were so small that they hardly mattered. The youngest were fed first. The older ones swallowed their hunger and let the little ones eat. The predators, watching from the shadows, hissed in frustration. This was not the result they wanted. Another time, the predators opened the gates just long enough to let in a wild beast, a small one, but dangerous enough to threaten the cubs. It growled, teeth flashing, eyes burning with hunger. The cubs froze at first, fear racing through them. But then, instead of scattering apart, they closed ranks. The older children moved forward, forming a shaky wall, while the younger ones crouched behind them. They had no weapons, no claws, nothing but their small hands and their will to protect each other. The beast lunged, but together they shouted, threw stones, and waved their arms. Their courage startled the animal, which finally retreated through the open gate. The predators, watching closely, were stunned. For the first time, they realized these sparks of defiance might one day grow into flames that even they could not control. Inside the den, after the beast was gone, the cubs collapsed in exhaustion. Some cried, some shook, but when they looked at each other, they smiled through their tears. They had faced danger and had not given in. They had proven something to themselves, that even in the worst darkness, they could resist. These moments changed them. Each small act built their spirit higher. Each trial became a lesson. The predators thought they were teaching the humans weakness, but in truth, they were teaching them strength. The cubs were learning what it meant to endure, to protect, and to rise together. In the stillness of the long nights, when the predators thought they were sleeping, the cubs whispered to each other. They spoke of home, of warmth, of sunlight and laughter. They spoke of a future beyond the walls. Those words, soft and fragile, were more powerful than the predators knew, for they kept hope alive. The sparks of defiance were no longer just actions, they were becoming a way of life. Every small kindness, every moment of unity, every shared struggle was fuel for a growing fire. And though the predators could not admit it yet, they had already lost something important. The humans were no longer just surviving the trials. They were shaping themselves into something stronger, something that could not be broken by fear, hunger, or cold. The den, meant to be their prison, had become their forge, and in that forge, the fire of humanity burned brighter each day. It began with small sparks, but soon those sparks would grow into a blaze that nothing could put out. The days inside the den seemed endless, blending together into a long stretch of darkness and trial. Each challenge had been cruel, carefully designed to push the human cubs beyond what their small bodies and young hearts could endure. Yet with every test, they had found ways to survive. They had leaned on each other, creating warmth out of cold, comfort out of fear, and hope out of despair. Still, the predators watched closely, waiting for the exact moment when that fragile hope would shatter. That moment never came. Instead, something else happened, something none of the predators had expected. It began quietly, almost too small to notice. One evening, when the cubs were huddled together after a long day of hunger and exhaustion, one of them began to tell a story. It was not a grand tale of heroes or victories, but a simple memory about playing outside under the sun, about laughter and freedom. The others listened, eyes wide, as if the words painted light in the darkness. Soon, another child shared a memory of warmth, of kindness, of the world beyond the cold stone walls. The predators thought nothing of it at first, but those whispers became a fire. The stories grew night after night. The children's voices filled the air with reminders of who they were, where they came from, and what they still believed in. For every cruel roar that echoed through the chamber, a human voice rose to meet it. The predators realized that no matter how much they took from the children, they could not steal their memories, nor could they kill their spirit. This was the beginning of the turning point. The predators, frustrated, tried new tactics. They released stronger beasts into the den, creatures with teeth sharper and muscles stronger. The test was clear. The cubs were expected to scatter in terror, to let the weakest fall behind, to prove that survival was only for the strongest. But what happened next shifted everything. Instead of abandoning each other, the cubs stood together. They picked up stones, broken wood, and scraps of metal. They shouted in unison, throwing what little they had at the creature. Their arms shook with fear, their eyes watered with terror, but not one of them ran away. Even the smallest children refused to leave the circle. The beast, confused and startled by their defiance, hesitated. It lunged once, but the wall of children held strong. They struck back with all their strength, shouting louder and louder, until the beast finally retreated, disappearing back into the shadows. The predators watching were stunned. This was not supposed to happen. No other species had stood together like this. All others had broken apart when fear came. Yet the humans had done the opposite. They had chosen unity over division, protection over abandonment. Inside the den, the children collapsed in exhaustion after the fight, trembling and crying. But through their tears, they smiled. They had discovered something vital, that together they were far stronger than fear itself. That night, no one slept quickly. They whispered about the moment, replaying it again and again, reminding themselves that they had faced danger head-on and had survived. It was more than survival. It was victory, however small. This moment lit a fire that changed everything. The predators noticed it too. They had meant to break the humans, but instead they had given them a reason to believe. And belief, they realized too late, was far more dangerous than claws or teeth. Belief could spread, it could inspire, it could turn even the weakest into something unshakable. The turning point did not come from strength of body, but from strength of spirit. The predators tried harder. They sent storms of smoke, floods of water, and crushing hunger. But the humans had already learned the truth, that they were never alone. They coughed together, they shivered together, they starved together. When one fell, others lifted them up. When one cried, the others comforted them. Every small act of kindness became a rebellion. Every shared burden became a weapon against despair. The predators could not understand it. For them, strength was always about domination, about who could stand alone at the top. But the humans had redefined strength. To them, strength meant standing together, lifting each other, refusing to let anyone be forgotten. The real turning point came one night when the predators released two beasts at once into the den. It was the hardest trial yet. The cubs were cornered, their bodies too tired and too weak to fight. For a moment, it looked as if the predators had finally won. But then something remarkable happened. The children did not panic. They moved with calm, surprising coordination. The older ones positioned themselves in front, distracting one beast while others created noise and movement to confuse the second. Some of them risked themselves to protect the youngest, drawing the attention of danger away from the fragile. It was not chaos, it was strategy. It was instinct turned into discipline. The predators leaned closer in shock. They had never taught the humans these tactics. No one had shown them how to stand as one. Yet here they were, shaping themselves through instinct, desperation, and unity into something that looked frighteningly close to soldiers. The beasts, confused by the humans' refusal to break, grew unsettled. The humans shouted, struck, and fought with everything they had until the predators finally withdrew the creatures. When the gates closed, the cubs fell into silence, their bodies covered in cuts and bruises, but their eyes burning with fire. They had not just survived the trial, they had faced overwhelming odds and proven they could fight back. That night, the predators argued more fiercely than ever before. Some believed the humans had to be destroyed immediately, before their spirit grew any stronger. Others whispered in fear that it might already be too late. For the first time, the predators were not sure of their control. Inside the den, however, the cubs did not think of themselves as warriors or rebels. They thought only of one thing, that they had not given up. That even when the walls closed in, even when everything screamed for them to surrender, they had chosen to stand together. And that choice changed them forever. The turning point was not just in their fight against the beasts. It was in the way they now looked at themselves. They no longer saw weakness when they looked at each other. They no longer saw children who had been abandoned in the cold. They saw a family, bound not by blood but by survival. They saw strength, hidden inside each of them, waiting to rise when the world tried to break them. In the stillness of that night, after the trials had ended, one of the cubs whispered words that carried through the group. "If we can survive this, we can survive anything." The others nodded, their faces glowing in the dim light. That belief was stronger than any weapon. The predators could not have known it then, but the moment had already sealed their fate. The humans would not break. The fire inside them would only grow brighter with each passing day. The trials meant to crush them had instead forged them into something unstoppable. That was the true turning point. Not the fight itself, but the moment the cubs realized the truth. They were not victims of the den. They were the keepers of a fire that could never be extinguished. And from that night onward, the silence inside the den was no longer a silence of fear. It was the silence of determination, of hearts beating as one, of a promise unspoken but deeply felt. The predators thought they were still in control, but the humans already knew. Change had begun, and nothing could turn it back. The air inside the den felt different now. The children, once fragile and unsure, carried themselves with a quiet strength that could not be hidden. Their bodies were still thin, their clothes still torn, and hunger still pressed on their ribs, but there was something in their eyes that no predator could erase anymore. It was the fire of defiance, the proof that they had walked through fear and discovered courage on the other side. The predators had expected them to crumble long ago. Every test had been designed to strip away hope, to leave only obedience and weakness. Yet instead of breaking apart, the children had found each other. They had chosen to stand together when everything told them to scatter. That choice had grown, roots deep inside their hearts, and now those roots had begun to spread. This was the rise of the cubs. It began with small changes. Where once they had waited in silence for whatever new cruelty would come, now they prepared. They sharpened stones, gathered scraps of wood, and whispered plans late into the night. They taught each other what they had learned. The best way. To dodge an attack, the quickest way to climb out of reach, the right moment to strike. Even the youngest, who once cried in fear, now listened with serious eyes, memorizing every word. The predators noticed. From their shadowed corners, they watched the humans moving with purpose, whispering with a new confidence. It unsettled them. These were not the helpless little ones they had thrown into the den. These were no longer prey waiting to be tested. They were something else, something beginning to shape itself into strength. When the next trial came, the difference was impossible to ignore. The predators released a beast larger and more dangerous than before, its roar echoing through the chamber like thunder. In the past, the children would have screamed and run, but not this time. They spread out, each one moving as if they already knew their place. The older children shouted to distract the beast, while others used the shadows to creep closer, striking from the sides. When the creature lunged, they did not scatter. They moved as one, guiding it where they wanted. And when the moment was right, they attacked together, using every scrap of strength to drive it back. The fight was long, and some were hurt. But when the beast finally collapsed and retreated, the children did not cry or collapse in fear. They stood tall, breathing hard, their faces shining with triumph. For the first time, the predators saw it clearly. The cubs were no longer surviving by chance. They were learning to fight back. That night, whispers filled the den again, but they were no longer whispers of memories or comfort. They were whispers of strategy, of courage, of possibility. The children began to dream, not of escape, for that still seemed far away, but of victory in the here and now. They had discovered that they were not powerless, and once a person discovers that, nothing can cage them fully again. The predators argued among themselves. Some insisted that the humans must be crushed immediately before their unity grew too strong. Others were fascinated, almost in awe, unable to look away from the transformation unfolding before them. They had wanted to break the humans, but instead they had created something stronger than they had imagined. For the cubs, the rise did not mean they no longer felt fear. Fear was still there, sharp and cold in their stomachs every time a new trial began. But now fear was no longer the master. They had learned to stand with it, to move through it, to turn it into fuel. And that was what made them dangerous. Days turned into weeks, and with each trial, the children grew sharper. They learned to read the predator's patterns, to sense when danger was coming, to prepare themselves for the worst. They turned the den itself into a kind of training ground, every shadow and crack teaching them lessons about survival and courage. Their voices grew stronger, their movements quicker, their resolve unshakable. The predators brought storms of cold, nights of endless hunger, and beasts with claws like blades. Each time they expected the cubs to finally falter, but each time the cubs rose again, bruised and tired but unbroken. With every challenge, they grew not weaker, but stronger, their unity deepening like stone pressed by years of weight. There came a night when one of the smallest children, once too frightened to even stand, stepped forward during a trial. With nothing but a sharp stone in hand, they faced a beast head-on while the others circled behind. The bravery was so pure, so undeniable, that it shocked even the predators watching from above. That night proved that the rise was not limited to the strongest or the oldest. Every single cub had the fire inside, waiting for the moment to burn bright, and so slowly but surely the balance of power began to shift. The predators still controlled the den, still held the keys, still decided when the trials would come. But within the walls, something had changed. The cubs no longer felt like captives. They no longer felt like victims. They felt like a force, small, unpolished, still fragile, but a force all the same. The rise was not only in their fights, but in the way they carried themselves outside of battle. They shared food evenly, cared for the wounded, and comforted those who cried. Where other species had fallen into chaos, humans had built something close to community, even family. And that sense of belonging became their greatest strength. The predators began to sense it too. When they looked into the den now, they did not see weak children waiting to be broken. They saw eyes that met theirs without fear, eyes that spoke of defiance and unspoken promises. The predators felt something they had not expected to feel: unease. For the cubs had risen not through claws or teeth, but through something far harder to crush: hope. The children did not yet know what would come next. They did not know if they would ever see freedom, or if the predators would end them before that day came. But deep inside, they carried a new truth: that they had already won something greater than freedom. They had won themselves back. The rise of the cubs was not about escaping the den. It was about proving that even in the harshest place, even under the cruelest hands, they could not be broken. It was about turning pain into strength, fear into courage, despair into unity. And so, night after night, trial after trial, they stood taller, their shadows stretching longer across the cold stone floor. They were still small, still fragile, still human, but now they were something more. They were the cubs who had refused to break, who had chosen to rise, and whose story was only just beginning. The predators thought they held the future in their claws. But in truth, the future was already shifting quietly inside the hearts of the children. Their rise was the warning, the promise, that one day the world would know what humans were truly capable of. The den was no longer the same place it once had been. The walls had not changed, the shadows were still cold, and the predators still lingered in the darkness. Yet something unseen had shifted, something deeper than stone or steel. The cubs were not the fragile children who had first been thrown into the pit. They had grown, not only in strength of body, but in strength of spirit. What had been forced upon them as cruelty had turned into the soil where their courage grew roots. This was not just survival anymore. This was a legacy being written. Every scar carried its own story: a scratch across the arm, a bruise along the ribs, a limp that never healed. Each one became a reminder not of weakness, but of endurance. When they looked at each other, they no longer saw hunger and fear. They saw warriors in the making, bound by the same pain, carrying the same fire. Even in whispers, they no longer spoke of despair. They spoke of tomorrow, of what they would do when freedom finally arrived, of the mark they would leave on the world. The predators thought the trials would erase humanity from these children, grinding away everything soft until nothing but silence remained. But instead, they had made the children into something sharper, something even the predators themselves began to respect. The very thing meant to break them had become their teacher. Hardship had carved them into living proof of strength. The younger ones began to imitate the older ones. They watched how the older cubs faced challenges with steady eyes, how they shared food even when it meant going hungry themselves, how they stood shoulder to shoulder no matter how dangerous the night became. These lessons passed from one to another without need for words. It became their culture, their way of being. This was how humans survived, not by being the strongest alone, but by lifting each other up until no one was left behind. And slowly, the predators realized that what they were witnessing was no ordinary struggle. They were watching the birth of a story that would outlive the walls of the den. One evening, after yet another brutal trial, the cubs gathered in a circle. Their bodies were tired, their skin cut and bruised, but their eyes still burned bright. They did not speak of defeat. They spoke of unity, of how each challenge had made them stronger. The smallest among them whispered words that would echo in their hearts for years. If we can survive here, we can survive anywhere. Those words were not just comfort, they were a promise. The predators tried to push harder. They unleashed storms, floods, beasts larger than ever before. But every challenge only deepened the children's bond. Every time one of them stumbled, two more stepped in to help. Every time despair threatened to pull them down, a hand reached out to lift them back up. They began to fight not just for themselves, but for one another. And that, more than anything else, made them unbreakable. The legacy of strength was not written in victories alone. It was written in the small acts that no predator could erase. The older child giving their last piece of food to the younger, the wounded walking on just to keep the group moving, the frightened learning to sing softly at night so others could rest. These moments, invisible to the predators, were the real victories. They were the seeds of something greater than survival. They were the seeds of humanity's future. Even the predators began to feel it. At first, they had seen humans as weak creatures, easy to crush, easy to silence. But now, when they looked into the den, they felt a strange unease. These children, once nothing more than test subjects, now carried themselves with the weight of something greater. It was as if they were no longer trapped at all, as if the predators had built their own prison, not for the cubs, but for themselves. The rise of the cubs had turned into a legacy, and that legacy had only just begun. One day, after a long night of struggle, dawn broke over the horizon in a way that felt different. The cubs stood together, exhausted but upright as the light touched their faces. They did not cheer. They did not cry. They simply stood in silence, letting the morning wash over them like a promise of something greater than the den. In that silence, the predators felt it too, that the story was no longer theirs to control. The legacy was not about the den anymore. It was about what the cubs had become inside it. It was about the fact that no matter what was done to them, they had refused to vanish. They had carved strength out of suffering, unity out of despair, hope out of shadows. Years later, when tales of those children spread beyond the den, people would speak not of how the predators tested them, but of how the cubs refused to fall. They would tell of how the smallest stood against beasts, of how the oldest protected the youngest, of how together they built something unshakable out of nothing. That story would inspire others, reminding them that strength does not come from comfort, but from standing tall in the hardest places. The predators had thought they were writing an ending. Instead, they had given birth to a beginning. The cubs' story would echo through time, not as a tale of victims, but as a legend of survivors. And even within the den, the cubs already knew it. They had no need for statues or songs. Their legacy was carved in their own bodies, in their own memories, in the way they held each other up against the darkness. It was written in the way they refused to let fear rule them, in the way they stood side by side no matter what. That was the legacy humans carried. The power to endure, the courage to rise, the strength to turn even pain into hope. The night no longer felt endless. The shadows no longer felt stronger than their spirit. The predators no longer seemed invincible. For the cubs had learned the most important truth of all, that strength is not given, it is chosen again and again, even in the darkest place. And so they stood together, silent yet unshaken, knowing that whatever came next, they had already written their story. A story not of breaking, but of rising. A story not of fear, but of courage. A story that would outlive the den, the predators, and even themselves. It was the story of a legacy written in strength,